Hey everybody, welcome back to Sociology 366. This is People in Industry. So I apologize for not being there today. It's Sunday evening and I am feeling rather under the weather. I've been kind of fighting a cold for a few days, and I think it's getting the best of me. And rather than drag myself to the campus tomorrow, I figured, as long as I get it posted well in advance, probably no one's going to mind a class where it is simply a recording of the material that we need to cover for the day, and then you don't have to come and all of this stuff. So, genuinely apologize for that. I much prefer to do things in class, but whatever. We'll get past it, and it'll be fine. So I'm going to take a knee for a day and be back on Wednesday, I'm sure, hopefully right as rain. So for today, I have recordings of the slides that'll cover the material for gender and paid work. So we will get you to go through that, and it's a little bit shorter than an average class actually, so it'll be perfect. So just watch this video, enjoy, and we will see you back on Wednesday.
Okay, so as we've talked about earlier in the course, right, women are an increasing part of the workforce, right? Really starting in the 1960s and 70s, we see an increase in female participation in the labor market. Women are getting more post-secondary degrees, and increasingly more than men, which means more and more they are career-minded and looking for, not just jobs until they get married, but career jobs that they're going to work in for their whole lives. Now, that said, and again, as we've discussed before, women continue to choose careers in a limited number of fields. The dominant fields for women continue to be teaching, nursing, and social work. These positions with somewhat limited wages and somewhat limited upward mobility. Men still occupy most of the high wage, high prestige jobs, although we are seeing some change in that, especially in medicine. So we generally still see gendered patterns in work. So basically, we see these contradictory trends. Women have more opportunities, but they continue to experience inequalities in the labor market.
Some of the most common occupations in the country, truck driving, construction, secretarial work, and nursing, are almost completely segregated by gender. Even some professions that require a high level of education, such as engineering, law, and medicine, are heavily skewed towards men. Why is that? One reason is that the occupations women dominate are in some way similar to the work they have historically done at home: childcare, nursing, and teaching, for example. Men, on the other hand, are more likely to go into professions that are not associated with domestic work, such as construction and engineering. Some of this segregation is the result of personal choice, likes and dislikes, as well as socialization from childhood. Some is due to sexism by employers and competition between employees of different genders. However, it's still the case that male-dominated jobs pay more than female-dominated jobs, even when they require the same level of skills and training. Job segregation is not simply a matter of personal preferences. It's an important part of the story of gender inequality in society.
So when we talk about women's work, women have always been involved in the economy. Now, because when we talk about wage work is a relatively new thing, right? It only comes about with the Industrial Revolution. So women's contributions economically have not always been part of say, the industrial or post-industrial economies, but they've always played a role, right? When we were looking back at kind of pre-industrial society, which was principally agrarian, right? Whether this be the feudal period or the Roman period, or any other society outside the West, whether it be, China or India or the Middle East, women have always been involved in the economic life of the community, right? They've been laborers on family farms. They have been, involved in all sorts of domestic kind of work, cleaning, childbearing, cooking, caring for elderly or sick relatives. This is all work that women have done. If we look at, the early part of the industrial period, we can talk about things like the putting out system of production, right? Where the factories would basically send textiles like clothing into women's homes, and women, between their domestic work, would sew, a pair of pants or sew a shirt or whatever it was that they were being asked to do by the factory, and they would be paid piecework essentially, right? So they'd be paid per unit produced. So women have always been part of the economic system. There's no time at which women have not been part of the economic system. It's just that when we talk about paid work in the way that we think of work today, women have, broadly speaking, had less access to the labor market, and their roles have been more circumscribed by social norms. Okay, so early, when we look at Canada, and this is true, I think, for many of the other industrial economies as well, we look at Canada's economic development, agriculture, forestry were key industries, or other kinds of resource production were key industries, prior to industrialization. Now, one of the things with these sorts of industries, right, when we talk about, agriculture or timber or fur trade or whatever it is, broadly we see, instabilities because of prices, right? Prices for all sorts of commodities have always fluctuated based on availability and all of these things. And many of the things that men have typically done, right? Agriculture, timber, fur trade are seasonal, right? So they bring in money at certain times of the year and do not bring in money at other times of the year. So one of the things that women's domestic labor has often done, in kind of pre-industrial periods, has been to supplement the family income by doing things typically that were producing things for sale in local markets, for sale to other people in the community, basically, which allowed them to raise a bit of capital for the needs of their families, right? So we can talk about things like, making preserves, right? Taking typically, goods vegetables out of a garden and making some kind of preserves, pickling, of all sorts of things is a common, making jams and these sorts of things were common ways of preserving food. And then some of that food could be sold at local markets, right? Allowing kind of a consistent income for those who maybe didn't have access to it, right? Those who had farms, broadly speaking, always had access to gardens, vegetables, and other things outside of even the crops that they grew. And this allowed them often to earn a substantial kind of amount of money on the side. They could make textiles, right? Knitting, sewing, these sorts of things, making clothing that could be sold. These were all things that women typically did. Okay, and here actually, I'll say that few women, prior to really the 1960s, were formally employed for long periods of time. Industrialization did bring more jobs for women. And they were seen as cheap, unskilled laborers that, were more pliant, less likely to unionize. The other thing I'll say about industrialization, and I think one of the interesting effects on women's labor, is that in a lot of ways, industrialization really destroys a lot of the ways that women were able to be, economically productive and contribute to kind of the lives of their families until very recently, I think, in the domestic sphere, right? So things like, textiles, making clothing, which were big parts of what women did to earn extra money. Obviously, as factories start to produce clothing much, much more cheaply and much more consistently, that market, broadly speaking, goes away, right? And even, to an extent, well, there are a few people that still know how to make clothing. broadly, the kind of seamstress or sewing skills, to make clothing for your own family, is I think broadly a skill that is kind of a niche now. It's not something that most women or almost anyone enjoys. Like there are seamstresses, right? There are people who know how to sew, but it's a small minority. It's kind of a niche craft at the end of the day. The same thing with preserves, right? Once you get canned goods, being produced in a factory setting, the need for homemade preserves becomes much less urgent, right? If you can just go down to the store and buy yourself another jar of pickles or another jar of not peanut butter, of jam, well, you don't really need to know how to make preserves. It's a nice kind of niche-y skill, right? Something that's kind of cool if you know how to do it, and it's neat. But at the end of the day, it's not really necessary in any meaningful sense. Um, and here, okay, another thing. Here's what I'll say, kind of a last thing. One of the other things that was commonly kind of an industry or a way that women could make money was to take in other people's washing, right? That basically, particularly single men who had neither the inclination or the time to wash their own clothing, would often pay women in the home to add that to their laundry, right? So they would do the washing for people. And now this, again, ultimately sort of gets destroyed by industrialization, and in the post-war period, by the production of washing machines and the invention and the opening of laundromats, right? Suddenly, you don't need to pay a woman in order to have her do your washing, because you can, insert your 5 quarters into a washing machine and a dryer at the laundromat. I actually have no idea how much laundromats cost. I'm assuming it's not terribly expensive. And there you go, right? Your laundry is done at the end of the day, right? So all these things, used to be industries or things that women did to supplement family incomes, along with other things like taking in boarders, right? So, letting people rent your extra room and you fed them. And that was another thing that was commonly done by families. All of this, borders, I suppose, are still something that happens, but at the end of the day, a lot of those other things that women used to do disappear with industrialization, which is in a sense why you end up with, after the Second World War, you end up in this situation where, broadly speaking, women are, relegated to the domestic space, and in a lot of cases are bored and have nothing to do, because a lot of the tasks that used to be really vital to social reproduction, to the family and keeping the family going, have been taken over by a bunch of machines, and a bunch of industries outside of the home. And so, women in the domestic space, there's a sort of stereotype of the like 50s housewife, right, in her nice dress and pearls and putting dinner on the table, right when her husband gets home. This is the kind of 50s sitcom image. But in a sense, right, like there wasn't much for women to do compared to other periods in time where their labor was really essential. A lot of the, mechanization of things had ultimately rendered traditional women's work really unessential. So this leads to, I think the return of women into the workforce in the 1960s, among other things, and changing notions of women's rights and women's place in society as well, right? But I think the fact that their labor in the domestic sphere is no longer really needed in the same way also plays a really, really big role in this kind of social transformation that happens. And it's not, I think, the definitive thing, but, there are, and I wish I could remember the title of the book. I read it a few years ago, and I've since forgotten what it's called. But basically the argument in this book was that the washing machine and the dishwasher, along with the microwave oven, fundamentally are the key technologies for women's liberation, because it removes the need to have women doing a lot of the labor that they've traditionally been doing, right? Which is like sitting in front of a wash basin with a washing board, those, you might know them, right? You might have seen them in old-timey films, or maybe your parents had one to get out those really tough stains, in the laundry room, which is like just this like board. It's like almost like a ridged piece of glass, and you could just soap clothes and kind of rub it against it really vigorously, and that's how people used to do laundry, right? Laundry used to be super labor intensive. That's why people didn't have a lot of clothes, right? They couldn't wash a lot of clothes. Today we have an excessive amount of clothes simply because, who cares? Like, we can wash it super easily. But all of this, these technologies, and the argument was like that the washing machine, the microwave oven, and the dishwasher are fundamental to women's liberation, because it basically means that women don't need to be in the home anymore, right? All of these technologies basically make women's domestic labor superfluous, and therefore allow women to go out and work in the rest of the economy without sacrificing sort of the cleanliness of dishes and clothing and children and all of these things. So, I mean, I think that's a really interesting and provocative argument to say that the laundry machine and the dryer are probably among the most important kind of inventions in the history of women's liberation, and the things that allow, for even the notion that women could go outside the home and work, right? And that this wouldn't somehow fundamentally damage the family or leave you with filthy urchins at home because nobody's there doing the laundry. I think it's a really provocative argument, and I think there's something to it, right? Because to even be able to think about women going into the public sphere and working, there needed to be transformations in the domestic sphere that made that thinkable and possible. Again, that's not necessarily saying that's all there is to it. There's obviously changing notions of women's place in society, of the rights of women. But to even make that economically feasible, there were some technologies that played into that as well. So even in places where women could be employed, after industrialization, where they had to go into industries to support themselves, prior to being married, often either by law or by employer demand, once they were married, they had to leave the workforce because it was expected that in short order they would be having a family, and therefore that they couldn't work because to work and have a family was not possible. It would be disadvantaging the children. And this was a very common view. So, women who wanted to keep working or who had to keep working for economic reasons were consigned to pretty menial jobs, things like housekeeping, and jobs like dressmaking, sewing, and domestic work. But basically, good paying professional jobs or factory jobs were reserved principally for unmarried women. So what you get when women are able, following kind of the women's rights movement, the introduction of contraception, and a whole bunch of other kind of social revolutions, is the intertwining of the public and private spheres of life, right? Women are no longer relegated to the private sphere, right, to the domestic sphere. They come and they work in the public sphere, in the market, in a much more consistent and broad way. Okay. What you get, though, is a continued need for women principally, and the imbalances, unfortunately, on the unpaid side continue, where women provide more of the unpaid domestic labor than men do, the labor that's responsible for what's called social reproduction, for basically keeping the society going. So though women now are in the workplace, they continue to be disproportionately responsible for cooking, feeding, clothing, and caring for children, the kind of compassionate work that women have typically done historically, but now obviously they're also doing work out in the marketplace, so things have shifted. Right, they're the ones still responsible for raising future workers, taking them to soccer practice principally, and those things. And so what you've seen from a lot of feminist economists is an argument that women basically have what's called a double day or a second shift, right? They go to their shift at work, right? They go do their day at work, and then they come home and still have to work at home in the domestic space, as much as always. Now, there are some improvements here, but broadly speaking, women still do much more of this kind of work than men do. So one of the ideas that emerged during the industrial period, and it really doesn't come to fruition until about the 1920s, but it was present, in the 19th century, was that at the end of the day, women shouldn't have to work, right? That a woman's place was in the home, and that the wages that a man made should be enough for him and his wife and his family to live off that, right? So you have this idea of what's called the male breadwinner, right? The man who goes and earns a living while the woman stays at home, right? So again, this doesn't really happen until about the 1920s at the earliest, when labor unions really improve the working conditions for people, and make it more possible, basically for a male wage to be enough to support a family. What the idea does, though, is it does restrict, women out of the labor market by making it seem like their place there is illegitimate, right? Working hurts their families because they're not there to take care of their kids, or they're not serving that social reproduction function. They're not doing all of those things. So, and I mean, if you want to go like one of the kind of critical debates, or critical kind of cultural debates, I guess, of say the 1980s was the kind of fear of what was called latchkey kids, right? Where kids would come home and let themselves in, like they had a key to the latch, right? Key to the lock to let themselves into the house, and then they would be unsupervised for hours because mom wasn't there to take care of them, right? Mom was off at work earning a living, rather than being at home to take care of the kids and supervise them and all of that stuff. So that's one of the kind of key ideas that comes out of the 1980s, when women are entering the workplace more, that they're abandoning their families, and we see that a lot. The other thing that the family wage ideology sort of did was created female dependency, right? Basically, women were not encouraged to work, and therefore, if they were in an unhappy or abusive or otherwise imperfect marriage that they wanted to exit, many of them simply lacked the capacity to do so. Because at the end of the day, right, you have to be able to support yourself in order to, escape from a marriage that you don't like. And many women were simply not able to, because the assumption had always been that men would make enough to support women, and therefore, at the end of the day, they were trapped, often in unhappy relationships. Okay, so some other things to think about. Principally driven by the availability of a bunch of different types of contraception, though principally the birth control pill, though other forms of contraception that come later also contribute, as does the availability of abortion on demand. We've seen a shrinking in family size, right? We go from the relatively large families of the 1940s and 50s to, a pretty average household being, two children, at most, right? Most kind of suburban houses, if you look now, are designed basically for a family of 4, mom, dad, and 2 kids. And that is pretty much the norm. And so what you get, is changes in all sorts of things, including working patterns, right? Like it used to be that, the period in which women were going to be having children was considerably longer than it is today, right? Where, if you were having 5 or 6 children, that typically meant that you were, going to be kind of, rearing young children for a relatively long period of time. Today, that's not as much the case, right? Today, 2 children, broadly speaking, typically with a separation of 2 to 4 years between each child, means you're rearing young children for a lot less time. So what you get in the 1970s is, when that youngest child goes to school, right, goes to kindergarten or first grade, a lot of women then, want to rejoin the workforce and get, restart the careers that they had before. So you do have people going back into the workplace for that. As you move forward into the 80s and 90s and 2000s, increasingly that period of interruption is shorter and shorter for most women. Women go on maternity leave and then return to the workforce very quickly. The other thing that forces a lot of women into the workforce is a declining standard of living, right? Real wages for men stagnate and don't rise quickly enough. And so in order to maintain a relatively high standard of living, at the end of the day, women often have to enter the workforce to also earn a wage to keep that family wage rising. And added to that, right, rising divorce rates following changes in divorce laws in Canada and the US, making no-fault divorce simpler, means there are more single women raising children needing to be in the workforce to support their families, which leads more of them, obviously, into the workforce to support their families. Okay, and just a few other considerations. Women's work patterns have not come to resemble those of men. Women, broadly speaking, have far more jobs in the secondary labor market than men do. Women work less hours than men, principally because they are juggling family and work responsibilities. And what we see with women in general is a ton of individualization in terms of their work, right? Basically, they sort of decide on how they want to work, whether they want to, increase work, education, how they balance domestic and household roles, what opportunities they want to take advantage of, based on personal needs, right? Based on what they want to do, where they want to do it. And so it's difficult to predict ultimately, whether, when, where, and for how much a woman will work for pay. Okay, so as a counterpoint to some of those feminist arguments, we have an argument from Catherine Hakim. And what Hakim basically says is that as opposed to, women's place in the workplace fundamentally being curtailed ultimately by sexism, that really the diversity in female employment can be better explained by their own personal choices. So she basically downplays the role that gender discrimination plays in the segregation and says that basically women themselves choose one of kind of three patterns for work. Either they are home-centered, right? The family is the priority. So this is your stay-at-home mom. Or maybe want someone with a small side business, something maybe Etsy based, something like that. Career centered, right? Work is the priority, or something adaptive, right? Where a non-career job, maybe a home business or a part-time job is blended with family responsibilities. And the fact that women do this ultimately explains why there's so much diversity. So Lisa Belkin makes a kind of similar argument in a column she wrote for the New York Times, where basically what she says is that women are not able to enter the workforce, but they're choosing not to or to leave the workforce because it's their preference, because they want to principally be at home with their kids because that seems more important to them. Now, critics of Belkin and Hakim in general suggest that there's other factors that have to do with why women opt out of the workplace, that may have to do more with, inflexibility of the workplace, right? Getting it hard for people to balance kind of working lives and family lives, poor access to childcare and an excessively high cost of childcare, discrimination, against moms in particular, and whether there's suitable work available, right? That'll balance these two roles. Okay, so we can talk about what are called female job ghettos. Basically, jobs that tend to be female dominated but offer little security, are physically taxing, have poor pay and poor opportunities. So these would be jobs in secretarial, hairdressing, beauty services, and domestic workers. And a not unsubstantial number of women work in these industries. And so sometimes this is called like female job ghettos or the pink ghetto. So traditionally what we've seen is that a lot of jobs are labeled as either being male jobs or female jobs, right? Some jobs are, to put it crudely, pink jobs, some jobs are blue jobs. My brother and sister-in-law actually split their household tasks along blue and pink jobs, so all good. And generally this kind of labeling has been meant to broadly restrict women from going into male-dominated jobs and to a lesser extent males from going into female-dominated jobs. So usually, some kind of gender bias, some kind of thought about, the traditional roles of men and women went into saying that one gender or another was inappropriate for this kind of job. Okay, the other thing, employers don't always make rational hiring decisions, right? At times, and particularly this has been true in kind of the corporate sphere, males will tend to, it's a concept called homophily. Basically, people tend to hire people like themselves. So males have tended to hire males because they can see the same traits that they have in those males. And since they've dominated the major spheres, they've tended to reproduce themselves in top leadership positions. And so historically, jobs that demanded female traits were the only ones available to women. And I have a little video clip here. This is one of those Historica minutes from Canada Post that basically, just illustrates this in a kind of historic sense.
Send them home! Get rid of them! Gentlemen, please. And so, this organ, which I regret I cannot name, because of the presence of these members of the weaker sex, who, although they are married, could not possibly endure...
Get them out.
Wishes, Ginny.
patience.
Get them out!
Dr. McFarlane!
Mrs. Trout.
There's no place for women in a medical school.
Get them out!
If you do not bring this classroom under control, I am going to repeat every word of this disgusting lecture to your charming wife.
My friend Jenny Trout was not the only woman to face this kind of thing in medical school. But she would become the first woman licensed to practice medicine in Canada.
Do. All right, so while I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time reading a chart to you, because you can clearly read this chart yourself, and it is in the textbook, you can see that if we look at kind of genders, labor market gender segmentation, that there are certain fields that are dominated by men, others that are dominated by women, right? So if we look at business, finance, and administration, almost 70% of the workers are female, but that's mostly in kind of administrative assistant roles. Natural and applied sciences and related, 3/4 are male. Health, 80% are female. Education, 70% are female. And then kind of rough parity in arts, culture, recreation, and sports, sales and service. Not huge disparities there. Transport, trades, and equipment, almost exclusively male. Natural resources, agriculture, and related production, 82% male. And, jobs that are in processing and manufacturing and utilities, 3/4 male again. Okay, I won't read this whole chart out to you like I did the last one, even though I said I wouldn't. But you can kind of see, right, that there are certain fields where, the bulk of women in particular work, right? You look at business, finance, administration, and again, this is mostly on the admin side. Health, education, and sales and service make up the bulk of where women work in the economy. And I think it's worth actually pointing out that when you look at trades, transport, and equipment, with a huge bit of this being truck driving, almost 1/4 of men end up working in that field. Okay, so as I said a couple of slides ago, this is kind of a breakdown. Basically we look at two broad categories as having more than half the female labor force: 1/4 work in sales and service, and 1/4 work in business, finance, and administration, mostly in secretarial positions. Women are more likely to be in the higher tiers of the service sector. However, where they are is education, healthcare, but principally on the nursing side, although the split with doctors is getting a lot better. We now have a majority of new graduates to medicine being female. So men too have their patterns, right? About 1/4 work in trades, transport, and equipment related fields, and 1/3 work in goods related sectors, manufacturing and resource extraction. All right, so some have pointed out that this idea of a standard job, a full-time or permanent job with benefits is a fundamentally male idea, right? It's a gendered idea, and one that goes with the idea of the male breadwinner. Now this is increasingly, it seems, like an artifact of the post-war system, where wages were rising and people could make a decent living, families could exist on a single salary. That increasingly isn't really the case anymore. But regardless, with this kind of gendered idea of, this great job, we continue to see, women more likely to seek non-standard jobs. They're the ones still generally that are wanting to have jobs that allow them to balance work and family. And this fundamentally leaves them more vulnerable, right? The kinds of jobs that are non-standard tend to be less supported, less benefits, more vulnerable, particularly more contingent all the time, and tend to come with poor training and little career support, right? And little upward mobility at the end of the day. Okay, so when last we met, we were talking about gender and paid work, and we've gone through a fair bit of material talking about the gender wage gap, the kind of employment that men and women do, differential pay, men making more than women on average, differential rates of death, men dying more often than women do. And we ended off essentially here talking about basically the racial dimensions of gendered work. So we talk about the racial dimensions. Basically, what we see is that minority women, especially recent immigrants, are much more likely to find themselves in the secondary or the peripheral job market. That women on the whole are more likely to find themselves there, and then minority women even more. The two places that they tend to really find themselves is in family-run businesses, particularly restaurants, the garment industry, so people who are doing alterations and these sorts of things, household laborers, cleaners, these sorts of things. So if you hire someone working at Molly Maid or one of these cleaning companies, there's a strong chance that these are often people from a minority background. The temporary help industry, right, temps, a lot of women from minority backgrounds, particularly recent immigrants there. And then if we look at a lot of the industries that basically serve the white middle class or the relatively wealthy middle class, that supports their ability to do the kinds of work they do, to have their children in care, to have a lot of food preparation done in food courts. A lot of this is done by people from minority backgrounds. And I think you'll get that just by your own experiences, right? When you go to a fast food restaurant or a food court, a lot of these are staffed by either temporary foreign workers or people who are recent immigrants.
Okay, so a few interesting things to talk about in terms of trends. As we've talked about at other parts of the course, women are earning a large number of undergraduate and postgraduate degrees today as compared with the past. So more higher education has meant more women in high status professions. So professions that would generally be outside of the nursing, teaching, and social work, that trifecta that we talked about earlier in the course. So just to highlight a couple things, right? 58% of new graduating doctors are women. So women moving aggressively into the top tier of the healthcare field. Now that said, still less likely to own their own practices, still less likely to be kind of owners of large clinics, but and still more likely to be at the GP level, right? General practitioner, less likely to be going into specializations. Not that it doesn't happen, but more men go into those specializations after getting the MD than women do. Okay, lawyers. About 40% of new law school graduates are women. Now there again, this is good news, high status profession. One of the things we find though with female lawyers, they're less likely to make partner, right? They're less likely to get into that really high status, really high paid position within law firms. And a lot of this has to do with balancing work and family. Female lawyers are more likely to, get to somewhere in their 30s and feel like they want to balance work and family and just kind of back off of some of the things that would get you to the partnership track. So less of them get on that track, less of them own their own law firms. Okay. By the 1980s, and this is actually this trend has been going on for a long time, about half of pharmacists were women. This is a profession where women hit parity quite a long time ago. And that number stayed kind of roughly stable. Women pharmacists, though, less likely to be owners or franchisees, right? So they're less likely to have their own independent pharmacy or be running the local Rexall as a franchise. Tend to earn lower wages because of that, right? If you own the franchise, you make more money, but they tend to have a higher job satisfaction than their male peers. And that's actually true for female lawyers as well. While they're less likely to make partner, they're more likely to be kind of happy with where they are.
Okay, so when we talk about the way that work is split along gender lines, there's basically two big terms that we need to talk about. The first one is horizontal occupational gender segregation. And this is basically the segregation of men and women in different occupations, right? Across different occupations. So if you think of a horizontal line, at one end you've got men, at the other end you've got women. Okay, so what does this really mean, right? Men, we've talked about this a lot through the course here. Men are more likely to be, say, in construction, in finance, in the STEM fields. They cluster in those places, and women cluster in teaching, nursing, and social work, right? And there's some bleed over, but those industries are broadly dominated by one gender or the other. And that's basically horizontal occupational gender segregation. One is at one end, the other one is at a different end. Okay. Vertical segregation. What vertical segregation basically means is even when you look within a particular industry, what you see is that certain genders cluster at different parts of that occupation. So probably the clearest example here is from teaching, right? The vast majority of primary school teachers are women, 88.4%. And yet when you look at, guidance counselors, that number drops to 77.1. And when you look at administrators, right, even though They make up 88.4% of primary school teachers. Only about half of principals are women, right? So that other 45%-ish is basically men, which means men are vastly overrepresented in the upper echelons of the teaching profession, in principals and administrators and these types of positions. And this is vertical segregation, right? Men are more likely to rise to those positions of authority and power within those kinds of industries. So it's segregated vertically, women kind of in education, in the lower tier jobs, the actual classroom teachers, and men more likely to move up into those administrator positions. So why do these differences exist? The argument from feminist scholars as to why we have horizontal and vertical segregation within workplaces is basically that men and women have done different tasks in the home, and through things like socialization, gender role socialization as children, and just the expectations that people bring into the workplace, they end up in different roles. Women, the argument is, will internalize their role as subordinate, right? The idea historically being that the wife was subordinate to the husband, these historical ideas, that basically they bring this into the workplace. And so when women enter the workplace, they act in a subordinate role to men around them. Okay. The other kind of idea here is that managers tend to hire and promote people like themselves. We call this homophily, right? The love of things that are like you. That male managers will hire other men, people who are like them. And this is an argument that cuts across both gender and race, right? The idea being that white male managers are likely to hire white males from a similar socioeconomic class, people that they can relate to because they think they're good managers, and therefore they think that people who are just like them are going to be good managers too. So a term that's sometimes used to describe the relationship between a woman, particularly a secretary or administrative assistant, and her male employer is the term office wife. So what this connotes basically is the idea that, in the way that historically women have organized men's lives at home, the office wife, like the wife at home, organizes the executive or the male employer's work in the workplace. And this is a very subordinate relationship for women, right? Often they are, kind of on call. This is the stereotypical, like you see in pop culture, they push the button on their phone and the secretary comes walking in, and she has everything organized for them, right? The secretary or the administrative assistant is subordinate to the male employer. And in cases, this can be problematic for a woman, right? If the secretarial role was one that someone was doing to get a foot in the door or whatever it happens to be, if they're too good at their jobs, they can become indispensable to their bosses, which means they won't get promoted because their boss can't imagine life without them. So essentially, you have to divorce your boss in a sense to get ahead in the workplace, which obviously is fraught with problems. Another problem that women sometimes face in the workplace is the problem of tokenism. Right? And what is tokenism? At the end of the day, tokenism basically is this problem that women have where, in order to have greater workplace diversity, an employer may actually bring them in. Bring in a woman, just to fill a spot and say, okay, we have X number of women working for us. But they didn't think that woman maybe was the most qualified for the job. They didn't want to hire them in the first place. It's just something they do to check a box. In these kinds of cases, that token woman, the woman who's brought in to show that we have women working in this place, often has to work harder in order to get ahead in the job because they were never considered the ideal candidate for the job. So in order to get ahead, they have to actually work harder. And just being different is a problem, right? Just being a woman in a workplace or being black or being whatever is a problem because you're there as a token. You're not there because they really wanted you. And therefore, you have to work harder in order to kind of make things work. Another problem that's faced, those stereotypical characteristics that are often associated with leadership, right? Toughness, decisiveness, rationality, agility, all of these things are often qualities that we've historically associated with men, right? Not to say that women can't have them, but historically women have been more associated with emotionality, intuition, compassion, nurturing, more so than those things we typically think of as the skills that leaders have. Now, again, obviously this is problematic. This is not true. But because these assumptions are deeply rooted in culture, often women are automatically disqualified from leadership roles simply because at the end of the day, people assume that they can't do the job.